What would you do if, at just 19, you buried your father beneath prairie soil, and the very next night, a mysterious widow appeared at your barn door carrying secrets that could destroy you? Would you turn her away to save your land, or let her in and risk everything? This is not just a story of storms and gunfire, but of choices that test the soul more than bullets ever could. The Wyoming sun sagged low, bleeding rust and crimson across the wide October sky. Wind slithered through the sagebrush, sharp with dust, carrying the kind of silence that pressed on a man's chest. Samuel Hartley stood at the edge of a grave, boots sinking into soil still damp and black from the spade. Beneath that earth lay his father, a man whose shadow had stretched over 800 hard acres and whose absence left the land hollow. 19 years old, Samuel was little more than a boy forced to play at being master. The cattle grazing at the fences seemed to study him, doubtful, as the townsfolk who had gathered earlier with murmured condolences that sounded more like predictions of failure. He turned toward the house, timbers cracked, shingles curled by decades of storms, and for a moment the weight of inheritance pulled at his very bones. From the road, a wagon rattled past. Jake Morrison reined his horse long enough to sneer, his words slicing the stillness. "Give it 6 months, boy. That ranch will be mine." The sound clung like burrs under Samuel's skin. His father had always taught him that the prairie tested men with silence and storms, not with idle talk. Yet Morrison's voice followed him into the barn, into the stench of sweat and hay, where every familiar creak only reminded him of the hollow seat at the table. He bent over the water trough, saw not the broad, commanding frame of his father, but his own lean shoulders, eyes weary, uncertain. That was when a voice drifted from the barn's entrance, soft yet edged with steel. "You're the Hartley boy, aren't you?" He spun around. A woman stood silhouetted in the dying light, cloak dusty, bonnet framing eyes green, as bottle glass eyes that looked older than her years. She asked only for shelter, a corner of straw for the night. Town had turned her away, branding her reputation uncertain. Samuel hesitated, torn between propriety and compassion. But in the end, his father's words echoed louder than Morrison's sneer. "A man is measured by the kindness he shows the weary." And so, with a nod, he let the stranger step across the threshold of his barn, unaware that with this single choice the prairie itself would rise to test him. The first night without his father was heavier than all the prairie storms Samuel had ever endured. He sat at the kitchen table long after darkness swallowed the plains, staring at ledgers his eyes could scarcely make sense of, columns of debts, wages unpaid, cattle counts that mocked his inexperience. Every number reminded him that he was alone, expected to carry a name that men like Jake Morrison were already circling like wolves. From the barn came faint rustles. Catherine Dalton, though he only knew her as the widow, then had made her bed in straw. Samuel's conscience battled itself. One voice calling him a fool for letting a stranger under his roof, the other whispering that no decent man would leave a woman to the mercy of the open road. His father's lessons returned in fragments, like wind-worn scripture. "The land will test you, boy, not with acres, but with choices." At dawn, hoofbeats shattered the brittle calm. Morrison appeared again, this time flanked by his 2 broad-shouldered sons, their horses restless, their smiles sharp. They sat the saddles like men certain of victory. "Morning, Samuel," Morrison drawled, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Heard you had company last night." Samuel's throat tightened, but his voice held steady. "Can't say that's your concern, Mr. Morrison." "Everything's everyone's concern out here," Morrison shot back, leaning close enough for Samuel to smell the tobacco on his breath. "Your father understood that, kept standards. But housing drifters, women of questionable character." He let the words hang, venom disguised as neighborly advice. Samuel stepped forward, fists curling at his sides. "You rode onto my land uninvited. That speaks to poor judgment." For a moment, silence coiled between them. Morrison's eyes narrowed, and his sons shifted in their saddles, waiting for a signal. Then, with a sneer, the rancher pulled his reins. "You're young. Young men make mistakes. but mistakes here carry consequences. Dust swirled as they wheeled away, leaving the threat to fester in the morning air. Samuel's heart pounded against his ribs, each beat echoing the truth. He had made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county. When he turned back toward the barn, Catherine stood framed in the doorway, her shoulders square, her expression unreadable. She had heard every word. "I'll be on my way," she said quietly. "I've brought you enough trouble already." Samuel shook his head, jaw firm. "The day I let Jake Morrison decide who I can give shelter to is the day I don't deserve this land." For the first time, her lips curved in something like a smile, faint, fragile, but real. "5 nights," she murmured. "Give me 5 nights' shelter, Mr. Hartley, and I'll work for my keep. Cooking, mending, whatever's needed. After that, I'll move on." He knew he ought to refuse. Every scrap of logic told him Morrison would use her presence like a blade against him. Yet in her eyes, green, fierce, weary, Samuel saw not danger, but defiance against a world that had cast her aside. Against his better judgment, he answered, 5 nights then. Neither of them knew it then. But with that single bargain, the fuse was lit. The first day of their uneasy bargain unfolded beneath a pale Sunday. Samuel threw himself into chores with desperate intensity, mending fence lines, checking troughs, driving cattle to water, yet his thoughts wandered back to the ranch house, where Catherine moved with practiced calm. When dusk painted the prairie in bronze, he noticed windows aglow, shadows shifting within. For weeks since his father's passing, the house had been silent as a tomb. Now it breathed again. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, beans, fresh biscuits, the kind of scents that once marked his mother's careful hands. Catherine worked as if she belonged, sleeves rolled, dark hair pinned, every motion precise. Samuel stood in the doorway, caught off guard by the sight. "You'll spoil me," he muttered, masking gratitude with a clumsy grin as he tasted warm bread for the first time in weeks. "Unlikely," Catherine replied, her tone practical though her eyes softened. "But a man running a ranch cannot live on grief and hardtack." Her words unsettled him, not for their meaning, but for the warmth buried inside them. He excused himself quickly, but her voice lingered like the echo of music long forgotten. That evening, storm clouds rose from the mountains, bruised and heavy. By nightfall, the first thunderclap rattled the shutters, and lightning carved jagged scars across the sky. Samuel's gut twisted. "The barn leaks," Catherine said calmly, meeting his eyes. "I'll not stay there in this weather." He hesitated. Proper judgment demanded she leave for town, yet the thought of her riding into darkness felt cruel. "There's a sewing room upstairs," he said at last. "Dry. Safe. You can use it for the night." Her gaze held his longer than courtesy required, something unspoken shimmering in the silence. Then she nodded, practical, accepting. The storm broke in earnest. Rain hammered the roof, thunder rolled like cannon fire, and the walls trembled. Samuel paced the hall, sleep far beyond reach. Then a cry pierced the noise. He reached her door in seconds. Catherine sat upright on the narrow bed, quilt clutched to her chest, face pale in the lightning's glow. "It's just the storm," she whispered, though her voice shook. "When Robert died, it was a night like this. Every thunderclap feels like the door breaking again." Without thought, Samuel crossed the room and sat beside her. "You're safe here. No one will harm you." She laughed bitterly. Broken. "You don't know what men like that are capable of." "Then tell me," Samuel urged, his eyes steady. Her green eyes glistened. 3 men came for Robert's debts. They killed him before me. One tried to take me. I found his derringer in the drawer. I shot him. The others fled. But I still see his face whenever thunder shakes the walls." Samuel's heart clenched. He should have stepped back, kept distance. Instead, he reached for her hand. "You did what you had to." "Did I?" Her whisper carried both guilt and defiance. He squeezed tighter. "Yes, you survived. That matters." She touched his cheek then, tender, trembling. Lightning flashed, painting her face silver. Samuel's breath caught. She was fragile and fierce, scarred and unbroken. "If you were older," she murmured, "you'd know better than to want this." And if I were younger, I might not care about the cost. I am old enough, Samuel said, his voice rough. Old enough to fight for this ranch. Old enough to know what I feel. Catherine's lips curved in a sad, knowing smile. Then prove it by surviving long enough to see tomorrow. Outside, thunder cracked again, but this time Samuel did not flinch. Their hands remained entwined until dawn, when the storm gave way to clear, unforgiving sky. And with that sunrise, Samuel felt something shift inside. He was no longer merely his father's son. It was a man standing beside a woman who carried shadows of her own. The morning after the storm dawned deceptively calm. The prairie stretched wide and blue, but Samuel felt the heaviness of a world circling closer. Trouble, he knew, was not gone, only waiting. By midday, riders appeared on the horizon. Dust swelled behind them like a storm cloud. Jake Morrison led the charge, Sheriff Wallace at his side, and more than a dozen men followed in a line that looked more like an army than neighbors. They halted at the porch. Morrison's grin was a blade. "Morning, boy," he drawled, hat-tipped without courtesy. Word spread that your house guest carries a past worth whispering about. Before Samuel could respond, the door creaked open. Catherine stepped outside. She wore her cloak again, hair pinned neatly, face calm though her hands trembled at her sides. "I'm Catherine Dalton," she said evenly. "What is it you want, Sheriff?" Wallace's voice was tired but firm. "There's talk out of Kansas. A man named Carl Hutchins was shot dead. His brothers claim it wasn't self-defense. They're pressing for answers." Samuel's stomach turned, but Catherine's voice cut clean through the air. "Carl Hutchins broke into my home after killing my husband. He tried to take me. I defended myself. A marshal cleared me. That's the truth." Morrison's smile sharpened. "So you admit to leaving death in your wake. Suits the reputation, doesn't it?" "That's enough," Samuel snapped, stepping forward. "You've no right." "No right?" Morrison barked a laugh. "I have every right when a boy's reckless choices put us all at risk. You're harboring a killer, and soon the law, or worse, will come crashing down on this county because of her." The sheriff lifted his hand. "Enough, Jake. She's not under arrest. Not unless new evidence surfaces." But Morrison was relentless. "Evidence or not, your ranch is crumbling. 5 days? Boy, that's all you've got before the bank calls your loan. And when you fail, this land will pass to me. All because you can't tell charity from folly." Rage boiled in Samuel's chest, but Catherine laid a steadying hand on his arm. Her voice was low, unwavering. "I'll be here 3 more days, Sheriff. Then I'll move on." "That was my bargain with Mr. Hartley," Morrison sneered, eyes glinting with promised ruin. "Plenty of time for consequences." With that, he turned his horse, his men thundering after him in a storm of dust. When silence returned, it was heavier than the thunder had been. Samuel's shoulders felt carved from stone, yet Catherine's gaze did not waver. "You should let me go," she whispered, "before Morrison takes everything from you. And let him decide who I can shelter on my land." Samuel shook his head. "No. I made my choice the first night you stepped into my barn." That evening the two sat beneath lamplight. Catherine's fingers twisted the hem of her shawl, her eyes distant. Finally she spoke. "You'll lose everything because of me." "Maybe," Samuel admitted. "Or maybe I've found something worth more than land and cattle." Her eyes shimmered, brimming, though no tears fell. For the first time since she had arrived, she reached for his hand across the table. Their fingers intertwined, fragile yet unbreakable. Days blurred with work and unease. Samuel labored from dawn until dusk, mending fences, driving cattle, keeping the ranch alive by sheer will. Yet shadows clung at the horizon, riders waiting, whispers spreading through town. Hutchins' blood still cried for vengeance. Morrison wanted the land. The bank wanted its due. And when the 5th morning rose blood-red, painting the sky like a warning, Samuel knew the reckoning had come. Dust clouds gathered from 2 directions, Morrison's men from the west, the Hutchins gang from the east, both bearing down on Hartley land with the certainty of fate. The sun climbed higher, staining the horizon a cruel red, as if the heavens themselves warned of bloodshed. Samuel stood on the porch, rifle clenched, every nerve taut. Beside him, Catherine loaded her derringer with steady hands. He wanted to tell her to hide, to stay safe inside the house, but she shook her head. "Not this time," she said, her voice calm, eyes locked on the riders, thundering closer. The two forces met like storm fronts colliding. Morrison's men advanced with pistols gleaming, while the Hutchins brothers rode wild with vengeance in their eyes. Dust swirled, hooves struck sparks on stone, and the sound of war drums seemed to beat in the ground itself. Gunfire cracked the silence. Bullets hissed through the air, slamming into wood, splintering the porch rail. Samuel fired from the window, each shot born of desperation more than skill. Catherine moved with chilling precision, her small pistol dropping a rider who had veered too near. The ranch, once silent in mourning, now roared with violence. Horses screamed, men shouted curses drowned by the thunder of guns. The Hartley house trembled with each blast. Smoke stung Samuel's eyes, but he fought on, shoulder aching from the recoil. Through the haze, he spotted Morrison circling wide, his revolver raised, hatred burning in his gaze. He wasn't aiming at Samuel, he was riding for Catherine. Samuel's breath caught. He swung his rifle. Too slow, too late. Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger, but before the shot rang out, a deafening roar split the chaos. A shotgun blast thundered from the ridge. Morrison jerked violently, thrown from the saddle. Sheriff Wallace lowered his scattergun, smoke curling from the barrel. For one fleeting instant, law had struck back against greed. But the battle was far from over. The Hutchins brothers pressed harder, their gang howling for Catherine's blood. The porch shuddered under the weight of bullets. Samuel felt himself drowning in the onslaught, a boy fighting against storms far larger than his strength. Beside him, Catherine's face was streaked with soot and resolve. She reloaded without hesitation, her voice fierce. "We hold until the law arrives, no matter what." Samuel nodded, though fear clawed at his chest. The prairie had finally revealed its true test. Not the silence of mourning, not the weight of debts, but survival itself, fought inch by inch in blood and fire. The fight raged like a storm that would not end. Smoke rolled across the yard, acrid and heavy, stinging Samuel's lungs. Each pull of the trigger sent fire through his shoulder. Yet he kept on, driven not by skill, but by the need to protect. Catherine moved beside him with a deadly calm, every shot deliberate, every breath steady. From the east, the Hutchins gang pressed forward, relentless as locusts. They screamed her name as if vengeance were scripture, bullets tearing through wood and shattering glass. Samuel felt the house itself groan under the punishment. Once a sanctuary, it had become a fortress crumbling stone by stone. One of the brothers, a brute with scarred cheeks, broke from the pack and charged the porch. His pistol glinted as he fired wildly. Samuel barely had time to aim before Catherine stepped into the open, her derringer steady. The crack of her shot cut through the chaos. The man collapsed in the dust, his rage silenced forever. Samuel's heart pounded. "You'll get yourself killed," he shouted, pulling her back. Her eyes blazed. "Then I'll die fighting, not begging." The word struck him harder than any bullet. This was not just survival, it was defiance against the world that had tried to break them both. More riders surged in, bullets screaming. A window shattered, shards glittering like falling stars. Samuel ducked low, reloading with trembling hands, but his gaze caught on Catherine. She moved with the poise of someone who had lived through storms darker than this, someone who had already buried love, fear, and innocence, and had risen from the ashes. Lawmen finally appeared on the horizon, their figures distant but undeniable. Sheriff Wallace, still gripping his shotgun, rallied them forward, yet the Hutchins brothers refused to yield. Their fury was not for land or money but for blood, and it burned hotter than reason. The prairie became a battlefield of dust and thunder. Morrison's men scattered without their leader, but the Hutchins fought like rabid wolves, willing to die if it meant dragging Catherine with them. Samuel felt his strength falter. He was no soldier, no hardened killer. He was a rancher's son, 19, standing in the ruins of a dream. And yet, when Catherine touched his arm, her voice cutting through the roar, he found a strength that was not his own. "Stand firm, Samuel," she said, her words like iron. "If we fall, let it be together." Something within him steadied. He no longer fought only for the land or even for his father's name. He fought because beside him stood a woman who had chosen survival over surrender, and he could do no less. The gunfire reached a fever pitch, echoing across the valley like thunder trapped between mountains. The Hutchins brothers hurled themselves at the ranch in one final push, their rage scorching hotter than the noonday Sunday. Samuel fired until the rifle's barrel burned against his palms, until every shot blurred into the next. Then silence, unnatural, sudden. Smoke drifted over bodies sprawled in the dust. Of the Hutchins gang, only two remained, the eldest brother and his kin, faces twisted with grief and hate. They dismounted, advancing on foot, revolvers drawn. "This ends with her," the eldest snarled, eyes locked on Catherine. Samuel stepped forward, blocking their path. His legs trembled, but his voice rang clear. "You'll reach her over my grave." The brother sneered. "So be it." He raised his pistol, but before he could fire, a single shot cracked across the yard. Sheriff Wallace's deputy, hidden until now, struck the weapon clean from the man's grip. Startled, the second brother faltered. Lawmen surged from the ridge at last, scattering what little fight remained. The Hutchins were disarmed, shackled, their fury silenced beneath the cold weight of justice. Samuel lowered his rifle, chest heaving, the world tilting with exhaustion. Catherine leaned against him, her face streaked with ash and tears. All around them lay ruined the barns, smoldering fences shattered, ground scarred with hoof prints and blood. The ranch his father built stood battered but still standing. "It's gone," Samuel whispered, despair clawing at his chest. "Everything father worked for." Catherine turned his face toward hers, eyes fierce even through the haze of grief. "Not everything, you still have me. And as long as we stand together, we can build again." In that moment, beneath the blood-red sun and the smoke of battle, Samuel understood his father's final lesson. The prairie did not test a man with acres or storms, it tested him with the choices he made upon them. And today, he had chosen love over fear, defiance over surrender. The Hutchins were led away, their threats broken. Morrison's body lay cold in the dust, his empire ended with a single shotgun blast. The land was scarred, but Samuel felt a new fire rise in his chest. This was no longer just inheritance, it was rebirth. The battlefield lay quiet, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of smoke rising from the barn. The prairie wind carried away the last echoes of gunfire, leaving behind a silence so heavy Samuel thought it might crush him. He lowered his rifle, hands trembling, body aching from recoil and fear. Beside him, Catherine's small pistol hung limp at her side, her green eyes distant, unreadable. Sheriff Wallace dismounted slowly, his face weathered with both relief and sorrow. "It's done," he said, voice low. "The Hutchins will stand trial. Morrison won't trouble anyone again." Samuel nodded, though the words felt hollow. He looked across the yard, fences trampled, troughs shattered, the barn roof torn and blackened. The land his father had poured a lifetime into was scarred nearly beyond recognition. For a moment, despair rose, threatening to drown him. What was a boy to do against debts, enemies, and ruin? Then Catherine touched his arm, grounding him. Her voice was soft, but firm as steel. "This ranch is wounded, yes, but so are we. And wounds can heal if we have the courage to tend them." Her words struck deeper than any sermon. Samuel saw in her face not pity but partnership, not fragility but strength. She had lost everything once, yet still she stood, daring to believe in survival. As dusk settled, neighbors began to arrive, drawn by the gunfire. Some came with fear etched on their faces, others with curiosity. Whispers rippled through them when they saw Catherine, the widow, at the center of storm and scandal. Yet none could deny the truth. She had fought as fiercely as any man. One old rancher spat into the dust and muttered, Boy's got more backbone than we thought. Another shook his head, but no one challenged him aloud. That night, by the faint glow of lamplight, Samuel and Catherine sat at the kitchen table once more. The ledgers lay open, debts glaring in the flicker of the flame. Samuel rubbed his eyes, the weight of numbers pressing down like chains. 5 days until the bank calls the loan, he murmured. Morrison's right about that. I don't know how to stop it. Catherine studied the columns with quiet patience. Then we find a way. I can sew, cook, barter with townsfolk. There are things a woman can manage where a man might meet only locked doors. Let me help. You've done enough, Samuel said, though his voice cracked with exhaustion. No, Catherine replied, her hand covering his. I've only begun. You gave me 5 nights when no one else would. Let me give you more than that. Samuel met her gaze, saw not charity, but determination. For the first time since his father's funeral, hope stirred, not grand, not blazing, but small and steady, like an ember refusing to die. The days after the battle stretched long, filled with labor that left Samuel's hands raw and his back bent. Dawn to dusk, he mended what he could, patching fences, hauling lumber, driving cattle away from the smell of blood that lingered near the barn. Each task felt endless, but beside him, Catherine worked with equal resolve. She mended torn shirts by lantern light, scrubbed the floor where boot prints and ash still marked the boards, and filled the kitchen with the scent of bread and coffee, a quiet defiance against despair. At first Samuel resisted her help, pride prickling like barbed wire. But each evening, when he returned from the fields to find supper waiting and the house alive with warmth, he could not deny she had given him more than food. She had given him back a sense of home. The townsfolk, too, began to shift. Some came offering tools or spare boards, more out of guilt than generosity, ashamed they had left a boy and a widow to face Morrison alone. Others brought whispers instead, watching Catherine with suspicion, repeating tales of Kansas and the man she had killed. Samuel heard it all, but he stood firm. She is under my roof, he told them, and under my protection. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Catherine sat on the porch sewing by the last of the light. Samuel leaned against the railing, exhaustion pulling at him, but peace settling slowly in his chest. He studied her silhouette, the sure motion of her hands, the calm strength that radiated from her. You've given me more than 5 nights, he said quietly. Catherine looked up, her eyes catching the fading light. And you've given me more than shelter. You've given me a reason to stay. Samuel felt his heart lurch. He wanted to speak, to tell her of the fire she had lit inside him, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he reached for her hand. She let her fingers rest in his, not clinging, not fleeing, simply present. The next morning brought grim news. The bank agent would arrive within 2 days. If Samuel could not pay the debt, the Hartley ranch would be seized. The thought gnawed at him as he worked, each hammer strike and shovelful of earth a reminder of time slipping away. That night, Catherine spread the ledgers across the table once more. There is value here beyond money, she said. Cattle, hides, wool. If we bring them to market ourselves, perhaps it will buy time. Samuel shook his head. 2 days is not enough. Then we find another way, Catherine said, her tone fierce. I will not watch Morrison's ghost claim what he could not win in life. Her fire stirred something within him. Samuel realized the ranch was no longer just his father's legacy. It was their battleground, their chance to prove that survival was built not on acres alone, but on will, loyalty, and love. The night before the bank agent's arrival, the prairie lay cloaked in silver moonlight. Every shadow stretched long across the scarred yard. Samuel walked the fence line, mind restless, body weary. He thought of his father, of the man's calloused hands and stern voice, and wondered if he had lived up to that legacy or betrayed it by letting strangers dictate his choices. When he returned to the house, he found Catherine still awake. She sat at the table, the ledgers open, her hair loosened from its pins. She looked up as he entered, eyes soft but steady. You doubt yourself, she said, reading the truth in his silence. Samuel dropped into the chair opposite her, burying his face in his hands. The ranch is failing. The debt is too great. Morrison's gone, but his shadow lingers. Tomorrow the bank takes everything. Catherine reached across the table, her hand firm on his. Land can be lost. Houses can be rebuilt. But a man is not measured by what he holds. He is measured by the courage to keep standing when all else falls. Her words struck like a bell in his chest. Slowly Samuel lifted his head. In her face he saw not pity but conviction, and something deeper still, faith in him. The next day dawned bright and cold. The bank agent arrived with papers and threats, his manner brisk, his pen sharp. Samuel met him on the porch, shoulders squared though his stomach twisted. Before the man could speak, riders appeared on the horizon, neighbors, ranchers, townsfolk. One by one they dismounted, carrying sacks of grain, tools, even coins clutched in rough hands. "We heard what happened," an old rancher said gruffly. "You stood against Morrison when no one else dared. We won't see this land swallowed up without a fight." The bank agent sputtered, but the weight of the gathered crowd silenced him. Enough was pledged to delay foreclosure, to buy Samuel time. Time was all he needed. When the papers were finally signed, the agent rode off fuming, and the neighbors dispersed, leaving only Samuel and Catherine on the porch. For a long moment they stood in silence, the prairie wind carrying the scent of dust and hope alike. Catherine turned to him, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "You see, even the land itself answered when you chose to stand." Samuel took her hands in his, holding them as though anchoring himself. "I thought I had inherited only debt and ruin, but what I've found is something greater." "And what is that?" she asked softly. "Strength," Samuel whispered. "Not mine alone, ours." The words hung between them, simple yet unbreakable. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky with gold, Samuel realized the prairie no longer pressed down on him with emptiness. It lifted, wide and endless, a place not of burden but of beginning. The prairie remembers. Long after the hoofbeats fade and the smoke clears, the land holds the stories of those who dared to live upon it. Samuel Hartley's story is not of conquest or victory, but of choices, fragile moments where a boy stood at the edge of ruin and decided to open his door to a stranger. In that act of kindness, fate was rewritten. For 5 nights he gave shelter, and in those nights the weight of generations pressed upon him. He faced ridicule, the threat of ruin, the fury of men hungering for blood. Yet through it all, he discovered a truth his father had only hinted at, that the land itself is not the measure of a man. It is the choices made upon it, the courage to defy fear, the compassion to see worth in the broken, the stubbornness to stand when storms demand surrender. Catherine Dalton, the widow, cast aside by a world that judged her unworthy, carried her own shadows. She had seen death, endured cruelty, and borne the guilt of survival. But in Samuel's home, she found something she thought lost forever. A place where her scars did not define her, where her strength was not feared but welcomed. She gave back more than she took, teaching him that dignity is not found in reputation but in the quiet resilience to begin again. Together they prove that love, born in fire and tested by loss, can outlast the fiercest storm. Their bond was not a fleeting passion but a covenant, unspoken yet stronger than law, that 2 broken souls could forge a life worth defending. The prairie took their sweat, their blood, and their tears, but in return it gave them meaning. And so the lesson endures. Strength is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Legacy is not the land you inherit, but the kindness you extend when the world tells you to turn away. Love is not rest, nor ease, nor safety. It is standing hand in hand in the ruins and declaring, "We will build again." The Wild West was a place that demanded hard men and harder hearts, yet it also revealed the quiet truth that even in dust and ruin, compassion is the bravest weapon. Samuel Hartley, 19 and unready, learned that the storms which threaten to break us often forge us instead. Catherine Dalton, weary and hunted, discovered that a stranger's faith could heal wounds no law could recognize. Their 5 nights were not restful, yet they became the foundation of something greater than rest, hope. And hope, once planted, grows stubborn roots, defying wind and fire alike. So let this tale linger in the silence after the guns are gone. A reminder that the prairie tests us all, not with acres, not with storms, but with choices. And when the dust settles, it is not the strength of the land that endures, but the strength of the heart